after U.S. President Donald Trump slapped duties on Chinese goods, China announced tariffs on goods from the U.S. worth $15 billion US. So are we at the start of a full-scale trade war between the world's two biggest economies? And after last week's Singapore summit between Trump and Kim, what is likely really happen on the ground in the DPRK for the ordinary people? I'll be talking to someone who has had a close insight into conditions there. Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. There are 1,000 reasons to make the China-US relationship a success and not a single reason to break it. That's what Chinese President Xi Jinping told his US counterpart Donald Trump back in 2017 during their Mar-a-Lago summit in the US. But now frictions over trade could be the reason. The trade tensions between the world's two biggest economies have escalated after US President Donald Trump's decision Friday to levy duties on Chinese imports. Hours later, China declared plans for tariffs of the same scale and intensity, which is to slap 25% additional tariffs on US goods worth $50 billion US. The Trump administration claims the practice is to prevent China from stealing US technology and reduce trade deficit. Some would say Beijing's high-tech policy, named as Made in China 2025, would divert its technological reliance on the US to its own independence. So is the US doing what it is doing so as to hinder China's high-tech rise? Will President Trump revoke the tariffs decision before it takes effect on July the 6th? Joining me for the discussion are Professor Tu Xinquan, Executive Dean at the China Institute for WTO Studies in the University of International Business and Economics, and from New Jersey, Michael Pento, President and founder of Pento Portfolio Strategies, an investment advisory firm. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Mr. Pento, let me come to you first. On Friday, when the Trump administration announced the imposition of additional 25% tariff on Chinese goods worth about $50 billion US, the US-China war on trade made global headlines. Given China's tit-for-tat posture, is it a trade war fully on, theoretically?
I think so. I think, sadly, you're correct. We are going for a full-blown trade war, but I wouldn't take it personally, Chinese citizens. Listen, Trump doesn't really have much affection for Canada or Mexico either. So it's a full-out trade war, not just against China, it's globally. And the reason is, this is the very nucleus, the center, the core of why he was elected president. I might not agree with it, and you might not agree with it either. But the fact is that the United States manufacturing base and middle class has been hollowed out. And you can blame the Federal Reserve, and you can blame the WTO, and you can blame trade policies. But the fact is, the Rust Belt in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, these people used to have viable, well-paying manufacturing jobs. And now they've become greeters at Walmart. They don't pay very well, and they don't have a pension, and they don't have benefits. That is the reason why Donald Trump is going to push these trade sanctions to the wall, not only in China, against the globe.
Professor Tu, the US government is not happy with China's vision or high-tech vision or its industrial policy made in China 2025. Actually, in a statement released on Friday, the Office of the US Trade Representative clarified that additional duties will be put on Chinese imports containing industrially significant technologies, including those related to China's Made in China 2025 industrial policy. So are such protectionist measures rare in global trade history?
Yeah, I think so. Actually, at least since the GATT was built in 1947, the US government has been pushing forward trade liberalization globally. And you can say the United States has been the major supporter of global trade liberalization. But now it seems that the US government is getting back from its previous policy, especially now it focuses on China's so-called Made in China 2025 industrial policy. But actually, there are rules already in the WTO about industrial policy, especially about subsidies. If China is really doing something wrong, the United States could go to the WTO to argue for their arguments and to defend their interests. So I still believe that the U.S. is against the rules made by himself. So it's really difficult to understand.
So it's President Trump and his administration against the rules that the previous administration set up. Now, Mr. Pento, let me go to you again. In May, Chinese President Xi Jinping sent his special envoy to the U.S. for trade talks in order to avoid a potential trade war. The negotiation was reported to have been constructive, and the so-called trade war was put on hold as China proposed importing more goods and services from the U.S., even though no specific numbers were announced. Now, the Ministry of Commerce of China said all agreements the two sides had reached weeks ago were effectively nulled and void because of the U.S.'s unilateral decision. So what is behind the U.S. dismissing the May consensus that could help reduce the U.S.'s trade deficit as China?
Well, you think you're confused. I manage money for a living. So Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin came out a couple of weeks ago and says, hey, tariffs are off. They're on hold indefinitely. And then a few days ago, we've got tariffs back on again. So try managing money in this environment. But here's the truth. The relationship between U.S. and China is a complete distortion of what trade is supposed to be. So, for example, if the U.S. makes a surplus of wheat, it should exchange that wheat for a Chinese surplus in steel. That's in a barter system. There would be no imbalances. But the system that we have today has huge imbalances. We have a $375 billion trade deficit with China last year, 330 if you include services in there. So what happens is that China ruins its environment and has a very healthy manufacturing base, a very healthy middle class, a growing middle class. The U.S. gets very low interest rates, and it has a stronger currency than it otherwise would have, but it has no middle class, an eviscerating middle class. But that's not the real danger. The real distortion comes in the fact that the Chinese people own a piece of America's future, IOUs, that the United States can never pay back. We owe China over $1 trillion, and this money is part of a $22 trillion national debt. Our deficits here in the United States are now rising to 6% of GDP, and this is in times of peace and prosperity. It's never before done. So when the recession comes, and believe me, if you look at global central banks, a recession is indeed coming. PBOC is tightening, the Bank of England, the ECB, and the Federal Reserve is not only raising rates, but it's also doing something called quantitative tightening, or reverse QE, to the tune of $600 billion a year starting in October. So a recession is indeed coming globally, and we are on the precipice, I believe, of another Smoot-Hawley trade tariff circa 1930, which helped exacerbate the Great Depression. So this is not a good scenario for anybody involved.
Yeah, Professor Tu, if the U.S. continues, coming back to this Made in China 2025 initiative, if the U.S. continues to choke China's high-tech flow in a protectionist manner, to what extent would it really affect China's goals outlined in the Made in China 2025 initiative?
I think the U.S. government has a very big misunderstanding about this Made in China 2025. I don't think it is a kind of very specific industrial policy, but rather a visionary industrial development plan. It is not a very specific industrial policies. And again, another thing is, I don't think that the innovation, the technology development of China is dependent on the Chinese government intervention, but rather on Chinese companies' efforts, including those foreign companies in China. So I would say the main source of China's technology development is market economy rather than government intervention.
Now, in a piece entitled With Tariffs, Trump Starts Unraveling a Quarter Century of a U.S.-China Economic Ties, the Washington Post said Trump's approach is rattling American corporate leaders and his Republican allies in Congress, and China's counter tariffs will target American agricultural goods, cars, and energy, which are expected to hit Trump supporters in farming states and the industrial Midwest. So, Mr. Pento, do you think President Trump is likely to change his approach anytime soon?
No, I really don't. I listen to him assiduously. I'm a big follower of what's going on politically here in the United States. And this is, as I said, the nucleus, the core of why he was elected. Mr. Trump does not like hundreds of billions of dollars worth of trade deficits each and every year. He doesn't like the massive obligations that we've amassed to China, of which we can never repay. He wants to build the middle class in this country, and there is no backing down from that position.
Professor Tu, then if this is what President Trump is determined to pursue, what kind of scenario are we potentially looking at? Is the Chinese government going to subdue anytime soon if President Trump continue to have this extreme pressure on China?
No, I don't think that the Chinese government has any other choice but to retaliate. Because it is very obvious that the U.S. government policies is against the WTO rules. The China is defending its legal rights under the WTO, and the U.S. Tariffs on Chinese goods will harm Chinese companies very significantly. So I think the Chinese government has to fight back.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Pento, if that is the case, if we do have a trade war, who's going to suffer more in your eyes, the U.S. economy or the? Yes.
They both are going to suffer greatly. Inflation here in the United States. I think China might start unloading its massive U.S. Treasury debt, rising rates here in the United States. So, and this is at a time, a very delicate time in the global macroeconomic infrastructure. So I'm very much concerned, but you have to understand that Mr. Trump is a xenophobic, ethnocentric president. He's a billionaire, and all he cares about is America, America first, and he doesn't hide that philosophy. And he is here to build America's middle class, and he doesn't think short term. He's thinking about his legacy long term. So if it means that he's throwing a hand grenade in the global trade system, he doesn't care about the WTO, he cares about the American middle class first, and that is what he will pursue as his primary goal.
Professor Tu, compared to trade with the United States, actually trade with other partners in Asia are actually more important. So if there is a trade war with the United States, how much impact will it have on China's overall exports? Very briefly, please.
Yeah, the U.S. represents about 1/5 of Chinese total exports. Of course, the U.S. is a very important market for China, but I don't think that the U.S. market is not replaceable. I think the world market is very big. We will manage to find other markets to do.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests, Professor Tu Xinquan, Executive Dean at the China Institute for WTO Studies in the University of International Business and Economics, and in New Jersey, Michael Pento, President and founder of Pento Portfolio Strategies. You have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a very short break, and when I come back, I'll be finding out what life is really like on the ground in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Stay with us. Despite decades of international efforts, the humanitarian situation in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is still looming. The latest United Nations humanitarian report published on April the 11th states that a staggering 40% of the population, or over 10 million people, including about 200,000 children, continue to suffer from undernutrition. Flooding, droughts and influenza in recent years have devastated the health of millions of people across the country. International sanctions on the DPRK have not helped preventing humanitarian aid from reaching civilians. Aid organizations are facing their own financial shortfalls. UNICEF faces a shortfall of almost $10 million to cover its programs in the country in 2018. So how can the international community ramp up its efforts in the DPRK? And after the historic Trump-Kim summit on June the 12th, will the country's new political environment ease the flow of international relief? Earlier, I talked to Gwendolyn Pang, head of the East Asia Delegation from the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, or IFRC. Let's take a look. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Lucien, for having me. And yes, this is a very important discussion.
Absolutely.
Yes.
That's why we're doing this. Well, as I mentioned, and as we saw in a video posted by FRC in May this year about the country's situation, about 18 million people in the DPRK are affected by severe food shortage, and 2 in 5 are undernourished. So you have been this part of the world for a couple of years. Over the past few years, would you say the humanitarian situation in that country has gotten worse or gotten better?
Yes, there are a great amount of humanitarian needs. We in the Red Cross are there to help them. We have done a lot of work together with them. We have a permanent office there since 1995. And we work closely with the DPRK Red Cross National Society. We do our own assessment, but we also are involved in this assessment done by the United Nations, which is published this year in the 2018 Needs and Priorities of DPRK that was approved by the government. The overall situation of health in DPRK is worrying us. So we are actually there to support them. But I think, Lucien, aside from that, we should not forget about around 58,000 people, in the list of the Korean National Red Cross in the South Korea that are waiting for this family reunification program to happen. So there's so much things going on. And also this one, we hope that the reunification will happen by August 15.
Yeah.
And this is a highly emotional experience
Right.
for the South and North Koreans family that were separated.
We'll talk about that in just a moment. I think it's a very important development, and a lot of people are very much excited about that prospect. But still, let's focus on the kind of emergency work that the IFRC is involved in the DPRK. According to the country's news agency, the KCNA, that in 2016, the country experienced the heaviest downpour in September since 1945, with tens of thousands of buildings destroyed and citizens suffering from great hardship. And this year, it is reported that hundreds of thousands of suspected influenza cases were reported. So what has the IFRC been doing to fight against these emergency situations, and what have been your achievements, but also the major headwinds?
Well, the IFRC always invests in preparedness, heavy preparedness program. So for this flooding that happened in 2016, this is in North Hamgyong, we have raised nearly 500,000 Swiss francs to assist 9,300 families or people. We were there to provide food aid. We also help in investing in early warning signal that people will be ready in case of another flood will happen to evacuate the place and area. And just early this year, we have there was an influenza outbreak in North Korea. This is primarily led by the lack of vaccine, and also the lack of antiviral medicine, also this protective equipment for the health workers. So we are addressing the needs there. But I think what is good is that we have invested in an early on preparedness program and preparing the people how to address in this kind of situation. When the influenza happened, the DPRK Red Cross right away went to the ground, even without assistance or aid coming in yet. They went to assess. They mobilized 800 volunteers to go and do the health assessment and also disseminate essential health teachings, how to promote proper hygiene to prevent further spread of the disease. And that one, I saw a big, decrease in the number of affected people or infections in DPRK in early this year. We're also, we have assisted, we released 300,000 Swiss francs that has assisted 373,000 people in DPRK for this influenza outbreak. But I think our role here and what we do is to continue to hold hands with the people to prepare them for a major disaster, because DPRK is very prone to natural disasters. So we help them in preparedness, resilience building through livelihood program.
Has it been easy, though, to hold their hand? Have they been receptive? And
Yes, they are very grateful of every single support that reaches them. And I think we have to continue to support them. I want to give an example of our work, say, for early warning system. So I had a chance to visit the countryside. So they showed me, they're so proud because what we provide them is actually funds to buy the materials, but they build the bridge, So they need the bridge to cross, from one island to the other island. And then in that bridge, they put the early warning marking. So example, if it's yellow, it should be caution. People should be cautioned that if the water will reach that level, people have to start to evacuate. And it will be at the red level, people have to leave the area. They were showing me that they're using it. They have drills. They're so thankful. And what you give them, they will continue to take care of it and use it and institutionalize this preparedness program in the community.
yeah, how about the local volunteers? How much work do you do with them, and how do they work together with international organizations like you to help people better cope with disasters?
Well, we are very thankful with the DPRK Red Cross. They are well positioned in the whole country. Because of them, we have access to the different communities. And they have strong volunteers. They have 134,000 volunteers in different parts of the country, well-trained for disaster, health promotion, and other very important humanitarian works on the ground. Yes, they are very open to learn in preparedness. They're very open to learn in health teaching program. When I went there at the height of this influenza outbreak, I've seen in the health centers that volunteers are the ones teaching health promotion in the community. So
they are the interlocutors, let's say, in a way.
Yes.
Yeah, interesting. Any concrete anecdotes, any stories or particular moments that stayed in your mind that you could share with us now?
Well, I think one of the things that really struck me about the greatness of the work of DPRK Red Cross, which was supported by the IFRC, because I went to a home of an elderly woman. She was living alone. She's living alone, and then she used to fetch water from the river. But we did a very good water system in that community that benefited 7,000 people. So they have now water source from a collection system, direct pipe to their kitchen and toilet. So she said, I have a poor knee. My knee is always painful now, but I don't have to walk to the river, fetch water, and bring home cook food, and also for my own sanitation need. So, and she said, because of this one, I can do other work. It's less time for fetching water. I can do other work. I can do some gardening and and fulfill some of the needs. So I think that one is for me strikes me so much, because the little thing that we do is actually a big thing for them.
Yeah,
And they're so grateful and thankful.
Yeah, and let us not lose sight of the big picture of the kind of difficulty the entire country is kind of in. I'm talking about sanctions, unilateral sanctions or UN sanctions, and I wonder whether those sanctions has disrupted the flow of international humanitarian aid to the country, and if so, do you think there should be a balance or there should be a separation between economic sanctions meant to give political pressure to the country and humanitarian aid?
Well, sanction has generally affected, humanitarian aid in many ways in the country. We have actually mapped out the different effects and sanction to different organizations and different, activities in DPRK with the support of United Nations. So they did that, and we have contributed also our part to that. Of course, it will be much better without sanction, Liu Xin. They'll be able to do more work. On the side of the Red Cross, so far we are using this exemption of sanctions to humanitarian organizations and humanitarian aid. So we did experience some difficulties, but we're able to find ways and solution. And one of the, I think, hurdle that we have now is the bringing in goods to the ground through the borders of China. But Chinese government has been very supportive of us as well.
Are you more optimistic, though, now that we've had this summit in Singapore? Do you think the situation will change for the better in the near future?
Well, we are very hopeful. And I think everyone have high hopes to this, especially us in the Red Cross. We in the Red Cross continue to commit that we will do to the best of our ability to help in moving this forward, this dialogue to the next step. So we are also, very hopeful for that we will be given space to talk about more humanitarian cooperation, because maybe this is already a history in the making, that we will be able to assist, change the lives, and do more effective humanitarian assistance to the millions of people in DPRK who are still in need of help.
Yeah, before we wrap up, any preparations going on for August 15, the next family reunion?
Yes, there will be a meeting between the South Korean Red Cross and the North Korean Red Cross, but we call them officially DPRK Red Cross and Korean National Red Cross on June 22. So we don't have a very clear picture yet what will be the discussion points and whatever, but this is not the first time. The two Korean National Red Cross from the South and North have been doing this for the past years, for many years already, but on a sporadic way. And we are hoping this time it can be more institutionalized, because as I've said, there are 58 people in the Korean National Red Cross list that are waiting for this reunification.
58,000 people are waiting. And time is running out for many.
Time is running out, and this is important. Maybe people don't see it. It's it is a unnoticed crisis, but for many people, this is so important to them.
Yeah. Gwendolyn Pang, head of the East Asia Delegation from the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And that is all for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.